Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here and I'm back with a new video. It's going to be the Game Week 2 team selection. And I got 78 points last week. I actually did a review video on it. So if you check on the exclamation mark above, you'll probably actually see that video. Those are my kind of immediate hot take thoughts on the price changes before Haaland and Kane had moved in opposite directions. And obviously as a Haaland owner, I did benefit quite well. And he's part of the reason why I didn't really have to make a transfer early on this week. But obviously, as we discussed the Game Week 2 team selection, I will preemptively say I didn't move into players like Zinchenko and Kulusevski, who also got price rises. So my team value at present is still just 100.2 million, mostly due to Martinelli and Haaland and their performances. We did discuss Martinelli being underpriced. I think Haaland potentially could be underpriced as we go on with the rest of the season. It really depends on how the City team plays around him and how fit he's able to stay for the rest of the year. But as things stand, got one free transfer, probably going to roll that. We'll discuss that later in the team selection. And in terms of my tinkerings, I really do think the template will change. We saw great performances from Darwin Nunez and Mitrovic, and I really think a lot of FPL managers will be moving their teams around, particularly the midfielders potentially. That sort of price point that Bailey holds, or that kind of spot of that 5.5 midfielder, might have to be changed around just so we can kind of accommodate team structure wise for some of these players, and even someone like Jesus might have to go. Ultimately, we'll see what we can do with the team when we go through the tinkerings later in the video. But if we actually head on to the Game Week 2 team selection itself, the defense is actually exactly the same as it stands. The reason why this was the case was because I did future plan a little bit with someone like Ruben Dias. He was meant to be my second Man City defender and someone who gave me triple Man City early on from the start. I was quite confident in going for Cancelo and Diaz. These are both players that I imagine to be nailed for the rest of the season. Haaland, the one who probably will get the least amount of minutes out of this current trident that I have. And I just didn't really want to deal with a Spurs fullback situation, which I think a lot of managers are thinking about quite seriously. You had basically great Sessegnon and Emerson performances on paper for Antonio Conte over the weekend, and we don't really know exactly what's going to happen with the weeks ahead. Yes, there could be great performances from Perisic, but are managers happy to deal with potentially 1 point? The same situation with Mahrez managers, but probably worse in that camp. Obviously, you saw Mahrez come on 88 minutes. I think Perisic is the type of fullback who will play 20 to 30 minutes if he doesn't start, so that's a little bit of a benefit there. But is it a significant enough benefit to warrant a consistent starting spot in your team? I think a lot of managers have to think about that, and potentially that question can only really be answered post the Chelsea game, because I think we're all expecting the Chelsea game to be tough and not exactly a representation of how good Spurs fullbacks can be over the rest of the season. They had an immediately great start versus Southampton, and the only issue, of course, is just going to be who's going to get the bulk of the minutes. Last season, it was players like Doherty, but we already saw this season at the start that it seemed like Conte has maybe changed his mind about Emerson and Doherty. Not so high on Doherty as he was over Emerson, I guess, in the previous season. And we'll have to kind of wait and see with Ryan Sessegnon, because he's spoken quite, I'd say, admirably about someone like Ryan Sessegnon and his ability to play alongside Perisic and even kind of lean on the experience of Perisic. So that's one thing to think about. As far as my actual team itself, it's really going to stay the same. I mean, the Arsenal defense still have really great fixtures on paper. No real reason to move off of Ramsdale. I'm really happy that I suggested White and Saliba on the cheat sheet. So if you could probably look at the exclamation mark above, that's one of the videos that I kind of recap all the positions in FPL. That might be more relevant for some of you guys who don't have the same team structure as me, potentially. But there's definitely the opportunity, I would say, to go into an Arsenal defender at 4.5, and I really think Ben White and Saliba will get a lot of minutes this season, because they're both players that have not been largely injury prone during their careers, and I think they'll do incredibly well under Arsenal and probably actually cost save you a little bit compared to, let's say, Gabriel and Ramsdale. I've actually changed my mind in terms of how valuable Zinchenko is as an asset. I do think he's actually better than Gabriel in my estimations, and that's not just simply because I think Zinchenko is the type of player who's playing within the fullback position and contributing. Otherwise, I'd be super high on Ben White for the same reason. But it's just because the positions that he was occupying in the Crystal Palace match were much more positive, that I would say, in the preseason than versus some other opponents. And some of that too might just be the role of the Crystal Palace fullback. They're definitely much more defensive in the structure, whereas in the preseason, Arsenal were definitely playing some teams with offensive fullbacks. So players like Reece James playing within a back three, that kind of changes the role you have to play as Zinchenko. He might have to play a little bit deeper to accommodate for that, whereas he was heavily involved in the Crystal Palace game, even though his assist came from a set piece. So that was kind of the main eye test takeaway from the Arsenal game. Definitely Zinchenko is the top asset in my opinion. As far as the rest of my team, as I said, very, very standard. Diaz is someone who's going to stay for a while now. The fixtures are just perfect on paper. Yes, there's the opportunity to go into Foden, but I'm already locked into triple City defense, and I do think City defenders are value for money. Maybe if Walker seems like he's going to continue to keep his position in the team, I might consider downgrading even from Diaz, but it does feel like a bit of a side grade transfer. But if I needed that 1 million in the bank desperately, and potentially that might be the case to go into someone like Darwin Nunez, then I think I will consider that in the future. For now, I do think that the backline is very, very template, and it's kind of set up in a nice way where Chelsea post the Tottenham game will have really, really good fixtures themselves, and I'm really happy to keep Trent as one of my kind of set and forget players alongside Cancelo. If we move on to the midfield now, you can see I've still kept things relatively the same. Luis Diaz, Salah, Bailey, and Martinelli. Yes, there's going to be one question, I suppose, from the chat, which is going to be Bailey versus someone like Andreas this week, and whether I actually start Andreas. Ultimately, I think the fixture for Bailey is much better on paper. Aston Villa playing at home versus Andreas, who's playing Wolves and Molineux. Completely different experience, I would say. I do think Wolves would play quite defensive just because they had such a poor start versus Leeds, contrary to, I guess, their preseason form and the expectations we had set over a team like Wolves compared to, let's say, Leeds, who ended the season really poorly and narrowly escaped relegation. So that's kind of the context setting there for why I've gone for Bailey, and probably the biggest question mark, I suppose, in my team. I know for a lot of managers who are dealing with players like Perisic and thinking about things like that with such a tough matchup on paper, I do think it's a good opportunity to actually gamble on someone like Andreas, as many people have said on Twitter and identified obviously themselves through watching the game of Liverpool versus Fulham. Andreas does occupy very, very good attacking positions, and I do think he's probably better value than someone like Perisic ultimately. For those reasons. So if you're kind of in that camp, I'd probably think about that. I just still think that the game on paper is still really good for Bailey, and I'm still expecting him to get probably 70 to 80 minutes, maybe not again another 90-minute outing, but that's sort of the expectations I have for Bailey, and I'm kind of hoping he does have, once again, a very good performance like he did in the pre-season quite consistently. Martinelli, Salah are going to be players that will probably stay in my team for quite a while. I really like the fact that Martinelli once again got around 89 minutes of play. That's a really positive sign ultimately for a player like Martinelli, who we do expect to be rotated a little bit later down the line in the season. For now, it seems like he's going to keep that spot for a while. I liked the fact that Nketiah came on and it didn't really interrupt Martinelli's minutes, which was very, very similar to what we saw in the preseason. And I think Arteta, as I said, is the type of manager who likes to keep things the way they are when Arsenal is in great form, and the reality is that they are, and Martinelli is one of those core pieces. He did miss a kind of poor chance, I would say, within the Crystal Palace game, but redeemed himself within the set-piece goal. So that's kind of one thing to think about, whether, if let's say Martinelli has one kind of one-off bad performance, does it signal to Arteta whether he moves into another player or brings back Smith Rowe into the lineup? That's another question I think we have on the cards potentially for game weeks 4 and beyond, but not so soon, and that's kind of a positive sign for now. As far as Luis Diaz, I know a lot of people are super low on him and have even been considering moving away from him, either into someone like Saka if they don't have triple Arsenal, or into City if they didn't have triple City. And I think those are both very logical moves. Definitely the Mount move is no longer on the cards because it seemed like Mount had a pretty bad performance versus Everton, and you have that Tuchel effect where he can be subbed off quite early, whereas you contrast that to someone like Saka for Arsenal, plays consistent minutes, and you contrast that to someone like Foden, who seemed to have garnered the trust of Pep. And you'd probably also, when you compare, let's say, City and Chelsea, on paper, and how many attacking chances they build up and how many chances someone like Foden can be involved in, it's completely different. I think worlds apart, really, which is why Foden is definitely a good option to think about. I just wouldn't make that transfer because I don't think it's that pressing. Luis Diaz, if you are someone who owns him, still should on paper be a fantastic pick to have for the next few weeks. Yes, there's a bit of a question mark to say how interesting can he be as an asset when Darwin's playing consistently. I do think he looks a little bit more interesting when Firmino plays, because Firmino occupies different areas on the field and he does play somewhat deeper, which allows for some of the wingers to play even more advanced. Whereas with Darwin, still a wait and see. We haven't really seen Luis Diaz play so well alongside Darwin, in my opinion, and that's going to probably be even worse when, let's say, Jota gets more minutes. We already saw someone like Fabio Carvalho take minutes away from Luis Diaz last week, so it's not exactly the most promising of signs, but I don't think it's the right time to move off of Luis Diaz now. I still think he had a good performance. He still hit the post, so he's definitely involved in key opportunities for Liverpool, and we expect them to build more chances, especially playing at Anfield, and hopefully making up for their rather lackluster performance playing versus Fulham. So that's kind of the context setting there, and why I haven't gone away from Luis Diaz as a Liverpool, kind of triple Liverpool owner. So he definitely is occupying a weird spot where, for both Robertson and Luis Diaz owners, I think people who might be upset if Liverpool fail to keep another clean sheet, or if Luis Diaz once again blanks, that the move to Darwin seems to be like an immediate move to make. And we'll see what happens, of course, with the upcoming game versus Crystal Palace, but I do think the template will change immediately because of that. And potentially that's also why Luis Diaz has been considered to be a worse option, because there's just a pressing need, in a sense, for a lot of managers, or looming in their minds, that by game week 3, we do need to move into a Darwin setup. And I'll probably talk about that when I talk about the tinkering. But for now, still confident Luis Diaz, still going to play with him. As far as the forwards, I'm definitely going to keep HAALAND and Jesus up top. No reason to change around. I was lucky in a sense to get HAALAND over Kane in game week 1. I didn't really want to punt on the game week 1 Kane captaincy, and that's kind of why I went with HAALAND. I was really interested in his performance versus Liverpool, and I definitely sat within the camp that was thinking, if he can get such great chances versus Liverpool, he can get such great chances versus any other team. And I think Bournemouth is a heavy opportunity to think about the captaincy with him. Jesus is someone who also had a fantastic performance. Jesus was someone who, in my opinion, yes, 80% of the ownership was probably around Jesus, but I think the reason why we picked him is still warranted. He was still heavily involved in chances. If you watch the Crystal Palace game, you'll know he probably could have gotten 1 or 2 assists. A little bit unfortunate, of course, that Martin Odegaard is so one-footed, but Jesus was still heavily involved in plays, just like he was in the preseason. And I think he can be such an electric player where you'll see individual performances where he gets a hat-trick basically within 15 minutes. And that's kind of the level that Jesus is capable of. And it raises a bigger question in terms of FPL of what to do with someone like Jesus. Do you move into someone like Saka so you can accommodate for moving into someone like Darwin and Mitrovic as well if you wanted to move into a 3? Or is Foden a viable replacement for someone like HAALAND? I'd argue not. These are kind of things we have to think about, how we actually best utilize our triple City assets, our triple Liverpool assets. And I do think that there's more of a pressing need to move into Darwin as the third Liverpool asset than there is a need to, let's say, get triple City by going for Foden. Foden for me is much less on the priority list, and I feel like it's kind of slowly deteriorating the value of the 8 million midfielder unless Saka becomes essential. And that might happen when Martinelli becomes less of a key option within the Arsenal team, or for some reason we don't value Jesus anymore as a pick. Ultimately, you could obviously cheapen, I guess, your team structure by going for someone like Mitrovic and avoiding Darwin if it seems like Luis Diaz is still a very, very good punt. But as I said, I feel like a lot of managers do agree and do feel like Darwin is going to be the receiver of the bulk of Liverpool chances, and that's going to immediately change our team structure ultimately. In terms of captaincy this week, I actually thought it was a very, very interesting discussion. There's a lot of things to think about here. You have Salah, who's obviously a Premier League proven talent. He's scored plenty of goals for Crystal Palace. I believe he's racked up 7 goals and 6 assists in 9 games independently versus Crystal Palace. But that's a lot of context setting for potentially nothing, because this is mostly versus Crystal Palace teams headed off by Roy Hodgson. And we know Patrick Vieira has vastly improved this Crystal Palace team as well. They looked very, very good versus Arsenal. I thought Arsenal were a team that actually showed how much they've improved in the offseason with some of the key transfers that they've made. And ultimately, that does signify probably that Arsenal is going to be a top team for me. That kind of performance versus Crystal Palace was one where in the last season, I do think Crystal Palace could have scored 1 or 2 goals versus this Arsenal team. Saliba is such a huge upgrade in the back, and he pretty much bails them out with 2 to 3 additional chances or kind of, I suppose, opportunities that opponent teams would usually seize within previous years versus Arsenal. And then you look at players like Zinchenko and Jesus, they provide so much more continuity and consistency. And even from the pressing point of view, these players are so much more used to pressing all the time and actually providing Arsenal with the attacking structure needed to consistently build chances from minute 1 to minute 90, which is a huge change in my opinion from someone like Lacazette, who I would say wasn't probably at his physical prime, to be honest. And when you compare it to Jesus just brings a completely different dimension to that team. And I think that was really evident in the short kind of bursts that Arsenal looked good versus Crystal Palace, because there were still many moments in the game where Crystal Palace controlled the flow of the game. And for me, that actually showed how good both teams were, and ultimately how much Arsenal have improved in terms of being such a composed unit and having such a strong starting 11. So that's for me my sort of immediate takeaway. And for now, I think the captaincy probably should rest on someone like HAALAND. When you think about the fixtures on paper, Crystal Palace is going to be finding themselves in a tough situation. They've never actually really comfortably dealt with Klopp's Liverpool, even under Vieira. They've lost, I think, 2-0 both times. So there is an argument to say Crystal Palace is definitely still not at the level of Liverpool. As far as Bournemouth, you have a huge kind of disparity here where Haaland is coming away from, or coming into the Premier League as a fresh talent. Did have a fantastic debut versus a very tough team in West Ham, scoring a brace. And you can see the pace and the diagonal kind of beautiful runs that he has shown on display. That just kind of really changes the dynamic of things. I think Haaland is so different to Kane from that aspect, where you're not really expecting Kane to score those types of goals. Those are goals that almost Heung-min Son could score, and he's also taking penalties potentially for City because Mahrez isn't going to get a lot of minutes this season too. So that changes a lot of things where, especially with Bournemouth coming in from the Championship, we do expect a bit of a drop-off, right, from a top-performing Championship team, and how they're able to kind of cope with us, City and Liverpool. They're simply worlds apart. And even though Bournemouth had a great performance versus Aston Villa, I still think that they were defensively quite fragile. Aston Villa were still able to build up a lot of possession, control a lot of chances, and we know what happens when City have the opportunity to do that versus weaker teams. And I feel like this is just a great opportunity to go for Haaland, even though he might not be as proven as Salah, and Salah might have a much better track record. As far as the Game Week 2, Salah never scoring in Game Week 2, I don't really think that should kind of factor into your arguments. I still think the captaincy is very close. I just prefer Haaland because of all the intangibles, such as him potentially taking penalties, and I don't really care that he's going to get 70 minutes potentially and get rested after scoring a brace, because that's probably good enough to match whatever Salah can muster versus a Crystal Palace team. I do think that the game will be quite low scoring. This Crystal Palace team does look really, really resilient. And I do think it'll be a similar scoreline to how it has been with Vieira teams in the past with Liverpool. And if it's going to be a 2-0 kind of scoreline, I'm probably expecting Salah to have maybe one goal involvement maximum. Whereas with City, I do really think they could crumple a team like Bournemouth 4-0, 5-0. That's sort of the level that City are at. And as the main benefiter of City chances, I do think Haaland is the better captaincy option. That's pretty much what it comes down to. The expected analytics, as far as expected goals, I mean, that's heavily skewed, first of all, by, I guess, league bias as well previously in the past. And if you just look at the one game, I mean, that's just not enough sample size whatsoever. So I really think you have to go with your eye test and your gut feeling with this one. I'm just going to go for Haaland because I just think it's the easier fixture on paper. And City have proven to already be able to do tremendously with Haaland in the Liverpool game and the West Ham game. And I just think he'll only get better with time. But this is a great fixture to kind of capitalize on still early on. And that's why I'm going to put the captaincy on Haaland. I also just wanted to tinker a little bit with you guys on the back end of this video, just to kind of think about future planning, what I'd like to do, because I am rolling the transfer this week. And that does obviously save me 2 transfers for Game Week 3, and I'll have to think about what my options there are. There obviously is the move to back into Kane on the cards as well, if I'm seeing that it's a great opportunity to move into Kane. I do think I'm less interested in that option now because it seems like Haaland is arguably fixture-proof in a similar way to Salah, and Salah could very, very well warrant our captaincy versus Man United, who still look relatively weak at that time. So I don't think that move is necessarily on the cards. However, I could potentially see myself moving into someone like Darwin, and that just might have to be through a little bit more of an aggressive play where maybe if I go off of Jesus and move into another Arsenal defender, I could go into double Arsenal defense. I do think that that's very, very risky. Probably not the move I'd like to make, but if I was to move off of Luis Diaz, there's also just an opportunity simply to move into someone like a Trossard or a Zaha at a price range just below Luis Diaz. So I could clearly move into someone like a Trossard around that time who has a great run of fixtures with Brighton. And especially if I'm, let's say, planning for a Game Week 8 type of wild card, Game Week 9, that sort of territory. I don't know if you guys been following Ben Crun's kind of fixture and transfer planner, but that's also an opportunity to move into a wildcard structure, especially since the World Cup will be looming and we'll have some additional transfers to make. So a little bit of an added benefit of an early wildcard this year for sure. So moving off of Jesus here, I'd potentially move into Darwin in this structure. And that does leave me with a little bit of money to play with. Potentially around that time, I'd like to downgrade Diaz into Perisic, and maybe I'd get some cash in the bank from there. Clearly, Bailey's going to be another question, I suppose, within this team, because around that time, Game Week 3-ish, you know he'll have tough fixtures. So we'll have to think about that too. If I'm looking at Haaland and I'm moving into Kane, clearly the opportunity to move into Foden is also an opportunity as well. So that's on the cards. As far as Bailey, it does seem quite tough to move out of this 5.0 territory within the midfielders. I know Dewsbury Hall has scored but I'd probably like to get some additional money back, which is something I would get in this situation. That additional 0.5 might allow me to push into someone like an Aronson or someone else within, let's say, Brighton, who's interesting, or even Neto if he continues to, perform well, I guess, against our expectations or initial expectations of him around that time in FPL. So those are kind of things to think about as well. Game week 3 is still a decent fixture for Aston Villa. Game week 4 and beyond probably is where it starts to get a little bit dicey, and that's probably where I'd start to think about moving away from him. But for now, I think it is also quite simple to play it safe, and definitely thinking about captaincy as a large amount of points is probably the most logical way to go about it. I wouldn't recommend a lot of managers to play around with very cheap sort of budget enablers and moving your transfers around those pieces in FPL, because the bulk of points is probably going to come from players like Haaland and Kane, and getting the right player in the right week is probably more significant in terms of getting the captaincy points, or even getting just 100% of the points of a specific player, just like in Haaland with Game Week 1. I definitely think there's a lot of hindsight bias between a lot of Haaland owners and how they outscored Kane in Game Week 1, but there's probably going to be opportunities where Haaland blanks and Kane has fantastic dividends from another fixture that we imagine to be very tough, maybe even Game Week 2. I don't really think that's super viable in the near future. I don't see myself moving off of Haaland. And if I was to move into a 4-3-3, I guess with another -4, that potentially could also mean that instead of going for someone like Trossard, I could go into Mitrovic. But then Bailey still has to be ultimately addressed. Mitrovic is quite interesting, especially around game weeks 8 and beyond, but I probably wouldn't think about that in the immediate fixture. I mean, if you look at, let's say, Fulham's upcoming fixtures as an example over here, you're looking at someone like Andreas, and the fixtures aren't particularly great. 4, 6, and 7 are all tough matchups. Even Brighton, I would say, are going to prove to be an incredibly tough test for a lot of teams. So definitely 8 and beyond, I'd probably think about moving to Mitrovic then. I know we saw some of the fantastic highs from Mitrovic versus Liverpool. I don't think he'll necessarily be playing at that level week in, week out. I know he showcased it last year as the leading scorer in the championship, but fixtures are fixtures, and you kind of have to evaluate that as well. So I really feel like maybe the FOMO on Mitrovic isn't as warranted as maybe actually someone like Darwin, who probably could absolutely break the template within these weeks where he's got a great set of green fixtures, especially when Mitrovic has tough ones himself. So if we were to break the template to go for 4-3-3, might even have to be incorporating, let's say, Darwin and Jesus in our teams. I don't really know how that's feasible at this point in time. I guess instead of going for someone like Luis Diaz, you could keep someone like Jesus in the team, and then you can move the money with Luis Diaz into someone else who's around 5.0, but it doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense unless I move off of Ruben Diaz himself. So for now, I'd say probably thinking about Darwin and how to get towards Darwin is the main goal, unless things change or unless Luis Diaz shows some exceptional form. But it's good to keep myself flexible as well, and I think most managers should stay within this camp. I do think the template is slowly moving into a 4-3-3 variation, but let me know what you guys and your thoughts are. I'll see you guys in the next video.